Her lips, warm but fake, brushed my forehead as she kissed me goodbye, a hollow gesture before she walked out the door. Still, I stayed in my worn armchair, staring at the space where she had been, her perfume still lingering in the air. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, I noticed the letter she left behind, a cold reminder of what she had taken. While I stared at the door, it hit me. She wasn't just my daughter-in-law. She had taken my trust, my home, and my son's loyalty. That's when the guard's voice shattered the silence. "Stop! Don't touch that glass!" The truth sank in. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd destroyed us. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains, painting thin gold bars across James Porter's worn armchair. The house was quiet in that particular way it always was since Helen died. Too still, too polite in its silence. Vanessa's perfume hung in the air, sweet and invasive, the kind that overstayed its welcome even after the guest had gone. She moved about the living room in her heels, tapping softly against the old hardwood floor, as if she owned it. Her voice was gentle, her laughter too smooth, every gesture carefully measured. James watched her from his chair, a steaming cup of tea cooling in his hands. She had come, as she often did lately, with David in tow and a tray of pastries she hadn't baked. The visit should have been comforting, a son and daughter-in-law checking on an aging father. Instead, it carried that faint strain beneath the surface, a rhythm he couldn't quite name. Vanessa leaned down to straighten a photo frame on the mantel. Helen's face smiled back from the picture beside one of her paintings, sunflowers in an afternoon breeze. The painting had always been her favorite, the one she refused to sell no matter how many offers came from collectors. Vanessa's gaze lingered on it a beat too long, her reflection caught in the glass. "Such beautiful work," she murmured almost to herself. "It deserves a wider audience." James smiled faintly. Helen painted for the heart, not for a crowd. "Of course," Vanessa said, her voice smooth as satin. Then she turned, walking over to him with the same careful grace that had once charmed the whole family. "You take care of yourself, okay?" David barely looked up from his phone. His thumbs moved quickly, his face lit by the glow of the screen. "Yeah, Dad, we'll call you in a few days," he said absently. Vanessa bent down and pressed her lips to James's forehead. The kiss was soft, deliberate, warm in gesture, but hollow in truth. For a second, he felt the same confusion he used to feel when Helen kissed him goodbye before a long day at the university. But this was different. There was no sincerity beneath Vanessa's touch, only calculation disguised as care. "Take care, Dad," she whispered, her tone perfumed with affection so practiced it could almost pass for love. James managed a nod, his eyes following her as she crossed the room. Her heels clicked, echoing through the emptiness that followed her every move. The front door opened with a cheerful creak, then closed with a thud that seemed to drain the air from the house. For a moment, James sat there, listening to the ticking clock above the fireplace. He noticed the faint outline of dust where one of Helen's smaller paintings had been moved earlier. He frowned. Had it always hung slightly to the left? He couldn't remember. Outside, Vanessa's laughter rang out as she called for David to hurry. Then the sound of the car engine hummed to life and faded down the quiet suburban street. James leaned back, closing his eyes, unaware that the farewell he'd just received wasn't affection. It was prelude. Somewhere between her kiss and that closing door, the first thread of his world had already begun to unravel. The morning arrived, wrapped in quiet routine. James shuffled down the hall in his slippers, the kettle whistling faintly in the kitchen. Sunlight poured through the blinds, warm and forgiving, until his gaze fell on the thick envelope resting atop the pile of mail by the door. Its seal bore a cold, bureaucratic logo, County Property Division, nothing friendly about it. He set down his cup, his fingers trembling slightly as he tore it open. Inside, black letters stared back at him in sharp, formal print. Notice of public auction. Porter residence. His name was there, printed clearly, sterile and final. His house, Helen's house, listed for sale to the highest bidder. For a long moment, he just stood there, the words refusing to take shape in his mind. Then, slowly, disbelief turned to a dry, hollow ache in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, dialing his son. The line rang once, twice. Then Vanessa's voice answered, smooth and practiced as always. "James, I was just thinking of you." He didn't return the greeting. "Vanessa, I just received something, an auction notice. It says my property, my home, is being sold. What is this?" There was a pause. Then her voice softened, feigning reassurance. "Oh, that. Don't worry, we're just protecting your assets. You know how messy things can get legally at your age." "My age?" he repeated, his tone sharpening. "Vanessa, I didn't authorize anything like this." "Oh, James," she said lightly, almost laughing. "You did, actually. Remember those forms I brought over? The ones for your medical coverage? You signed them. Everything's in your best interest, I promise." The room tilted. He could still picture that day. Her standing by the kitchen counter, folder in hand, her smile gentle, reassuring. "These will make sure you're protected if anything happens," she'd said, her voice syrup smooth. He'd trusted her. He hadn't even read the fine print. Helen would have reminded him to. But Helen wasn't there. The phone trembled in his grasp. "Vanessa," he said slowly, his throat dry. "Those weren't medical forms." Her tone shifted, still calm but colder now. "I think it's best if you speak to David. He's very stressed right now. We're all doing what's right for the family." Before he could reply, the line went dead. James stood in the kitchen, the silence pressing heavy against his chest. The notice in his hand blurred as his eyes filled. Every inch of this house, every corner, every brushstroke of Helen's paintings, was stitched with memory, and now it was being taken under the guise of care. He sank into the nearest chair, the weight of realization settling in. His signature, his trust, had been turned into a weapon against him. Through the window, the wind picked up, scattering the rest of his unopened mail across the porch. White envelopes fluttered like wounded birds, tumbling down the steps, spreading across the lawn. James didn't move to stop them. He only watched, each paper twisting in the air, fragile as the faith that had just been betrayed. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope, embossed with gold lettering. "Vanessa Porter presents the Modern Grace Collection." James almost didn't open it, but curiosity and something colder made him attend. That night, the city lights of downtown San Diego shimmered on the gallery's glass facade, like they were mocking him. Inside, laughter bounced off the white walls, the air perfumed with money, art, and self-importance. He stepped through the entrance, leaning slightly on his cane. Everywhere he looked, strangers in sleek clothes sipped champagne and murmured admiration for the visionary Vanessa Porter. His eyes adjusted slowly to the bright lights, and then he saw them. Helen's paintings. Every stroke, every color, every canvas she'd poured her heart into, now hung under Vanessa's name. His breath caught. The sunflowers by the bay, the one Helen had painted after their trip to Carmel. Morning Window, her final piece before the cancer took her. Each one carefully framed, labeled, and displayed as if they belonged to someone else. "James," Vanessa's voice cut through the crowd. She glided toward him in a shimmering dress, a diamond pendant flashing at her throat. Cameras followed her like she was royalty. "I didn't think you'd come," she said brightly, kissing the air beside his cheek. "I wanted tonight to honor family. Your late wife inspired me more than anyone could imagine." Her words were honey over ice. James's gaze drifted to a plaque beneath one of the paintings. "Collection curated and inspired by Vanessa Porter." His jaw tightened. "These were Helen's," he said quietly, the words barely pushing past his throat. Vanessa smiled, as if he'd made a charming mistake. "Oh, of course, dear. But art belongs to the world, doesn't it? And someone had to make sure Helen's legacy wasn't forgotten." She turned away before he could answer, her laughter folding into the hum of applause as she stepped to the center of the room. "Friends," she began, raising her glass, "these pieces reflect resilience, femininity, and rebirth. They were my inspiration." David stood nearby, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes darting nervously between his father and his wife. He forced a smile when the crowd turned to him. "Yes, Vanessa's worked very hard," he said, voice flat, rehearsed. James's hands trembled as he stepped closer to one of the paintings, Helen's self-portrait, the same one that used to hang above their fireplace. He could still remember her saying, "If anyone ever touches this, promise me you'll notice." His fingertips hovered over the small corner of the frame where her faint signature curled in delicate paint. Helen Porter, 1997. It hadn't been removed. It had been claimed. Champagne glasses clinked. A photographer called Vanessa's name. Guests toasted her vision, their cheers echoing through the marble hall. The sound hit James like a dull roar. Each voice a reminder that the love of his life had been turned into a prop for someone else's vanity. He turned quietly, slipping out before anyone noticed. The night air outside was cool against his skin. As he walked toward the car, city lights blurred in his eyes. The grief that had once been soft and private now hardened into something else, sharp, steady, and waiting for truth to surface. The next morning, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy with unspoken rain. James hadn't slept much. The memory of Helen's paintings hanging under Vanessa's name had replayed in his mind like a cruel loop. By sunrise, his decision was made. He dressed with deliberate care, pressed shirt, polished shoes, the quiet dignity of a man who refused to vanish. Then he drove to the gallery. The building loomed in front of him, its glass walls gleaming cold in the early light. Inside, the faint hum of air conditioning and the scent of polish filled the empty space. The gala remnants still lingered, half-drained glasses, scattered brochures, the echo of laughter that didn't belong to him. Vanessa appeared before he even spoke, descending the staircase with the poise of a woman expecting applause. A flute of champagne shimmered in her hand, bubbles catching the light. Her smile was a smirk dressed as sympathy. "James," she said smoothly, "you should have told me you were stopping by. We could have scheduled a tour." "I'm not here for a tour," he replied, his voice measured, quiet but edged. "You displayed Helen's paintings without my permission. They were never yours to sell or show." Vanessa took a slow sip of her drink, eyes glinting. "Everything displayed here is legally under my name now. You signed the documents yourself, remember?" He stared at her, the faint tremor in his jaw, the only sign of his restraint. "I remember signing forms you said were medical. Not this." She shrugged lightly, feigning innocence. "Misunderstandings happen, but the art is safer here than collecting dust in that old house." James's patience cracked. He walked past her, his cane striking the marble floor in short, deliberate beats. The paintings lined the far wall like stolen ghosts, Helen's ghosts. One in particular drew him forward, the morning sea, her favorite, the one she painted after their 30th anniversary. The color of the water had been taken straight from a photo he'd shot that day. Seeing it now under gallery lighting felt obscene, stripped of intimacy. He lifted a hand, fingertips almost grazing the frame, just to feel the glass that once guarded her work. "Stop! Don't touch that glass!" The shout cut through the air like a whip. A security guard in a black suit stormed toward him, one hand raised. The entire gallery seemed to freeze, the sound of his own breathing suddenly too loud. James lowered his hand, turning to face Vanessa. She stood a few steps away, her smile curling into triumph. She leaned in slightly, her perfume sharp, voice low enough for only him to hear. "It's not yours anymore." The words slid into him like a blade. For a long moment he said nothing. The guard's glare burned, the polished floor reflected his stillness. Then James turned toward the door, shoulders heavy, but spine unbent. As he stepped back into the sunlight, the sting of humiliation spread through him, not fiery like anger, but cold and deep, like salt water finding an old wound. He didn't look back, but inside, something irreversible had shifted. The shame would fade. The resolve taking its place would not. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, gray and restless, the waves rolling against the pier like slow breaths. The seaside cafe had always been one of James's quiet places, a spot where he and Helen used to sit with their morning coffee, watching gulls chase scraps. Now, it was where he'd come to start something far less peaceful. Grace sat across from him, her silver hair tousled by the wind, eyes sharp despite the years. She had been Helen's best friend, the kind of woman who noticed things others missed. Today, she noticed the tremor in James's hand as he stirred his coffee. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and tapped a name. "Lucas West," she said, pressing call. James looked up. "You think he'll answer after all this time?" Grace gave him a knowing half-smile. "For you, he will." The phone rang twice before a voice answered, firm and familiar. "Grace Dawson, it's been ages." "We need you," she said simply, then handed the phone to James. Within an hour, Lucas West walked into the cafe. Older now, hair grayer, suit a little more worn, but his stride still confident. His briefcase hit the table with a soft thud as he clasped James's shoulder. "You look like a man who's seen better weeks," he said, voice low but warm. "I've seen worse betrayals," James replied. They sat, and James told him everything. The medical forms, the auction notice, the gallery humiliation. Each word came out steady at first, then rougher as the weight of it resurfaced. Grace listened quietly, her eyes flicking between the two men like she was watching a wound reopen. Lucas didn't interrupt. He simply pulled the folded documents from the envelope James had brought, the ones Vanessa had tricked him into signing. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the pages line by line, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Well," he said softly, "that's not just unethical. That's fraud by misrepresentation." James stared at him, waiting for the next words, the ones that could turn humiliation into something useful. "She falsified consent," Lucas continued. "You never received independent legal advice, and she concealed the true nature of what you were signing. If this goes to court, she's in serious trouble." James's eyes steadied. "Then we fight," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was deliberate, grounded. "We fight clean. No shouting, no spectacle, just truth." Grace's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Helen would want that," she murmured. The three of them sat there for a moment, the ocean roaring faintly in the background. The gulls circled overhead, their cries lost in the wind. Lucas closed the briefcase with a snap, his expression hardening into purpose. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, dimpling the cafe windows. James didn't flinch. He simply watched the gray horizon, feeling the slow rise of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Resolve. The comeback didn't begin with a shout or a plan. It began in silence, with three people sitting at a seaside table, ready to reclaim what was stolen. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and chatter, the air thick with perfume and the hum of self-congratulation. Vanessa Porter stood at the podium, a vision of grace in a crimson dress, pearls gleaming at her throat. The banners behind her read, "Community Hearts Gala, presented by the Porter Foundation." To the untrained eye, she looked like the perfect philanthropist. To James, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, she looked like a thief in designer silk. Her voice carried across the room, confident, practiced. "Tonight isn't about me," she said, pausing for applause that came too easily. It's about giving back, about family generosity. She lifted her glass, smiling for the cameras. My family's contributions have made this possible. Together, we're building a legacy of compassion. James's jaw tightened. My family's contributions. The phrase twisted inside him like a knife. He could see her rehearsed humility, the calculated pauses. Every dollar she was parading tonight came from the home she'd stolen, the art she'd sold, the lies she'd built. Unnoticed, Lucas West moved through the back of the room, a small recording device tucked discreetly in his hand. He wasn't dressed for glamour, plain suit, neutral tie, but his eyes missed nothing. From behind the floral centerpiece near the stage, he began recording. Vanessa continued her speech, her tone growing syrupy. When I decided to donate the proceeds from my family's estate, I knew it was what Helen would have wanted. That was it. Lucas caught James's eye across the room and gave the smallest nod. James stepped forward through the murmuring crowd, steady despite the tremor in his cane. Heads turned. The applause faded. The microphone's hum filled the silence as Vanessa froze for just a breath, her smile flickering. He stopped a few feet from the stage, his voice calm, deliberate. "Vanessa," he said, and the room seemed to tighten around his words. "Tell me something. Did you donate your own money or mine?" A sharp intake of breath rippled through the guests. A few exchanged looks. Someone coughed. Vanessa blinked rapidly, her poise cracking for half a second before she forced a laugh. "James, this isn't the time for confusion. Let's not make a scene." Lucas pressed a button. The speakers crackled and a recording played, Vanessa's voice unmistakable. "He won't even notice. I forged his signature on the transfer papers. It's all legal enough if no one digs too deep." The sound washed over the room like a cold tide. Cameras flashed, gasps echoed, and the murmur grew into a low storm of whispers. Vanessa's expression faltered, her painted confidence bleeding into panic. "Turn that off!" she snapped, stepping toward Lucas, but it was too late. The truth was already spreading across every face in that room, visible and permanent. James didn't gloat. He only watched, eyes steady, voice quiet enough for her alone. "You took everything, Vanessa, but you forgot. Truth doesn't stay buried." Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. The room's applause from earlier was gone, replaced by the sharp click of cameras, the glare of exposure. And as flashbulbs lit the stunned crowd, Vanessa stood frozen beneath them, her perfect smile finally cracking into something real: fear. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the ceiling fan and the faint crackle of the evening news still playing in the background. James sat at the dining table, a stack of documents spread neatly before him. The light overhead threw long shadows across the papers, stamps, seals, signatures, all the evidence of betrayal laid bare in black and white. When the front door opened, he didn't look up. He heard David's steps before he saw him, slow, uneven, the steps of a man caught between disbelief and dread. His son stopped in the doorway, face pale, jaw tight. "Is this true?" David's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it trembled with something raw. James finally looked at him. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. He turned one of the documents toward his son. "You tell me." David stepped closer. The paper shook slightly in his hands as he scanned the notary seal, the forged signature, the faint indentation where his father's name had been pressed under false pretenses. "She said these were for tax protection," he muttered, voice breaking. "That everything was temporary until we could straighten things out." James didn't interrupt. He'd already rehearsed this moment in his mind, but no version of it had felt this hollow. David dropped the papers onto the table, running both hands through his hair. "She told me you agreed, that you trusted her." "I did," James said quietly, "and she turned that trust into currency." David's breath came uneven now. I thought she was helping. I thought she cared about keeping the family together. Greed never is temporary, James replied, his tone soft but cutting. It just learns how to smile. David sat down heavily, the chair creaking under his weight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room, a slow, merciless rhythm. Then came the sharp slam of a door. Vanessa's voice cut through the stillness, like glass breaking. "So this is what you've been doing?" she hissed, storming into the room, her heels striking hard against the tile. "Plotting against your own family, against me." David didn't turn. He only stared at the table. Vanessa's eyes darted to the papers spread before them, each one proof of what she'd done. Her face flushed, fury mixing with fear. "You're destroying this family, James," she shouted, voice cracking. "Everything I did was for us." James rose slowly, leaning on his cane. He met her eyes, not with anger, but with quiet conviction. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You already did." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Vanessa's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David finally looked up at her, and in that silence, something between them broke, cleanly, completely. She turned and left without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading into the dark. James gathered the papers into a single stack and set them aside. The house felt heavier now, but also, strangely, clearer. Somewhere in that silence, the line had been drawn. The war for truth had begun, and there was no going back. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper, polish, and nerves. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, striking the rows of empty benches, where soon reputations would be tested. Lucas West stood beside James near the clerk's desk, his briefcase open, papers meticulously stacked. His expression was calm but alert, the look of a man who had done this dance many times before. James, in his neatly pressed jacket and polished shoes, looked more like a retired professor than a plaintiff. But there was a quiet gravity in his eyes that the years hadn't dulled. Lucas leaned toward him. "Once the injunction is filed," he said softly, "they can't touch the property. Not a sale, not a transfer, not even a repainting without court approval." James nodded slowly. "So, it buys us time." "Time," Lucas replied, sliding the stamped papers across the counter, "and leverage." Across the lobby, Vanessa stood with her attorney, a younger man in an expensive suit with too much confidence and not enough experience. He glanced towards James, lips curling in a smirk. "Senile claims again?" he muttered loudly enough for them to hear. "I hope he remembers what day it is when the hearing starts." James caught it. He didn't flinch. Instead, he let his gaze drift, blinking slowly, as if the words had gone past him unnoticed. Lucas gave him a sidelong glance, one that said, "Let them underestimate you." When the hearing began, Vanessa took her seat beside her lawyer, her poise immaculate. She wore a cream suit, hair pulled back, her face the perfect picture of control. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched low, read through the motion. "Mr. Porter is claiming fraudulent misrepresentation in the transfer of property?" Lucas stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have evidence of falsified signatures, hidden accounts, and mischaracterized documents." Vanessa's lawyer rose immediately. "Objection. My client acted only under medical advisement for Mr. Porter's well-being. The man can barely recall his own paperwork." James shifted in his seat, eyes half-lidded, the image of an aging man caught between memory and fog. It was deliberate. He fumbled for his glasses, taking a moment too long to find them. A faint murmur rippled through the room. Then Lucas spoke again, calm but firm. "If Mr. Porter is indeed senile, Your Honor, how was he capable of signing a property transfer that conveniently benefited only his daughter-in-law?" The question landed like a pin in silence. Behind closed doors later that afternoon, Lucas and James reviewed a wall of evidence: dated emails, wire transfers, and forged medical notations. Each piece formed part of a larger puzzle, one that pointed straight to Vanessa's calculated deception. "She's been moving assets in and out of shell accounts," Lucas murmured, tapping a file. "We trace this. We trace her motive." James leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Let's make sure she finally sees what honesty looks like on paper." By the time they stepped back into the hallway, Vanessa's lawyer's smirk had vanished. Her charm had started to crack, replaced by the first faint glimmer of panic beneath her polished veneer. The war between them had officially left the dinner table and entered the courtroom. No longer whispers, no longer pretense. From here on, every lie would have a paper trail, and James was ready to follow it to the very end. The days following the injunction blurred into quiet chaos. Papers flew between lawyers, investigators combed through records, and for the first time, Vanessa's empire of control began to tremble. But she wasn't one to surrender. When cornered, she improvised, and deception was her favorite art form. Late one night, the glow from her laptop illuminated the living room. The blinds were drawn, David asleep upstairs. On the screen, she carefully adjusted numbers in a set of digital bank statements. Transactions redated, payees changed, balances inflated. Each keystroke was precise, cold, deliberate. She printed them on heavy paper, slipped them into an envelope marked evidence, family accounts, and left them where she knew the investigators would find them the next morning. By sunrise, Grace Dawson had already arrived at Lucas's office with fresh coffee and a cautious optimism. "We're close," she said, setting her bag down. "If Vanessa's trail is this obvious, it won't take long." Lucas nodded, flipping through the new bank records the investigators had submitted. Something, however, made him pause. The paper was wrong, too new, the ink slightly smudged, the formatting subtly inconsistent. Grace leaned closer, brow furrowing. "These transfers," she said softly. "Look here. The font doesn't match the other documents, and this logo, this version wasn't even used by the bank until last year." Lucas exhaled sharply. "She's still forging. She's trying to bury us in false trails." Grace's lips tightened. "Then we expose her again." Meanwhile, at home, David sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone, Vanessa pacing behind him. She'd sensed the shift, the distance in his silence, the hesitation in his tone. "You believe them, don't you?" she said finally, voice dripping with accusation. David didn't answer. He opened his inbox, scrolling through an email Lucas had forwarded, photos of the altered documents, the analysis attached. His chest felt hollow, his heart pounding too loud to ignore. "She said it was temporary," he murmured under his breath, almost to himself. "You said you'd fix it." Vanessa stopped pacing. Her expression flickered, first confusion, then defense. "I was protecting us. Your father's lawyers are twisting everything." "Stop." David's voice cracked like glass. He stood, turning to face her. "Every time I look at you, I hear another lie. You forged his signature, you stole his house, and now you're fabricating records to save yourself. Do you even hear yourself anymore?" Her face hardened. "You're choosing him over me?" she hissed, her words sharp enough to sting. David didn't blink. "I'm choosing truth." For a long moment, they stared at each other, husband and wife, two strangers standing in the wreckage of trust. The silence stretched, electric and fragile. Then Vanessa's breath hitched. Her polished composure, the charm she wore like armor, fractured before his eyes. "You think you can survive without me?" she whispered, voice trembling with fury. But David didn't answer. He turned away, the weight of finality in his shoulders. Behind him, Vanessa's mask fell completely. The woman who had once ruled rooms with smiles now stood trembling in her own home, her reflection in the window warped and unfamiliar. For the first time, she realized the walls were closing in, and this time there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom felt colder than usual that morning. Polished wood, fluorescent lights, and the faint shuffle of papers. All sterile, all indifferent. James sat at the plaintiff's table beside Lucas, his hands folded neatly, a small notebook resting before him. Across the aisle, Vanessa looked composed on the surface, her cream suit immaculate, her chin high. But the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her necklace betrayed her calm. The clerk called the session to order. The judge, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, scanned the documents before her. "Mrs. Porter," she began, voice steady but firm, "the court has reviewed the evidence regarding the disputed property transfer." Vanessa's lawyer rose, quick to interject. "Your Honor, my client only acted in her father-in-law's best interests. There was no malicious intent, no attempt to defraud." Lucas stood before he could finish. "Intent is irrelevant when deception is proven," he said. His tone was measured, precise, but carried the weight of quiet confidence. "The signatures were falsified. The financial transfers were concealed. We request immediate suspension of Mrs. Porter's control over all associated assets." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. The judge raised her hand for silence, eyes narrowing as she flipped to the notary statement. "The court finds sufficient cause to grant the injunction. Effective immediately, Mrs. Vanessa Porter's temporary control over the Porter estate is revoked pending full investigation." The gavel's strike echoed through the room like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Vanessa's breath caught, the blood draining from her face. Her lawyer turned to whisper something, but she was already on her feet. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "He's manipulating you, pretending to be some helpless old man." The judge shot her a look that silenced the room again. "Sit down, Mrs. Porter." Across the aisle, James exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. It wasn't victory, just the faint scent of justice beginning to take root. Outside the courthouse, the media waited. Cameras flashed like lightning as they stepped into the daylight. Reporters called out, "Mr. Porter, is it true your daughter-in-law tried to steal your home?" "Mrs. Porter, did you forge your father-in-law's signature?" Vanessa pushed through the crowd, ignoring every question. David followed a few paces behind her, face pale, eyes distant. When she reached the car, she turned to him. "Get in," she ordered. He didn't move. "David," she snapped, voice rising above the chaos. "Get in the car!" He met her gaze for only a second before shaking his head. "I'm not doing this anymore." Then he turned and walked toward Lucas and his father without another word. Vanessa stood frozen as the cameras closed in, her polished world cracking in real time. "He's playing the victim," she spat under her breath. "That's all he knows how to do. Pretend." Lucas leaned toward James, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "Let her talk. Every word buries her deeper." James didn't respond immediately. He just watched Vanessa's figure shrink behind the swarm of reporters. Then, for the first time in months, a faint, knowing smile curved at the corner of his mouth. The tide had shifted, quietly, decisively. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the truth had drawn blood. The invitation came in the form of a handwritten note. "Dinner tonight, just the three of us. Let's put this ugliness behind us." The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, like the woman herself. James hesitated for a long time before agreeing. Lucas didn't like the idea, but James insisted. "Some wars," he'd said quietly, "end better when you look your enemy in the eye." The table was set with silver and candlelight, the kind of soft glow that tried too hard to promise peace. Vanessa greeted them at the door, her smile just a shade too wide. "I thought we could all start fresh," she said, taking their coats. Her voice trembled beneath its practiced warmth. The meal was beautiful, too beautiful. Perfect roast, polished wine glasses, everything curated down to the folded linen. But the room felt airless. Like truth had been invited, but refused to sit. Vanessa's hand shook slightly as she poured the wine. The red liquid trembled in the glass, catching the flicker of candlelight like blood caught in motion. "So," she began, eyes darting from James to David, "I heard the court date's been delayed. Maybe that's for the best. Emotions have been high." James didn't answer immediately. He cut his food with careful precision, as though the silence itself were part of his reply. When he finally looked up, his tone was calm, measured. "Delays don't change truth, Vanessa. They just give it more time to surface." She forced a light laugh. "Truth, yes, of course. I only meant perhaps the lawyers are misinterpreting things. These misunderstandings happen all the time." James leaned back slightly, studying her face. "Misunderstandings require innocence," he said. "You've never been misunderstood, Vanessa. You've just been believed for too long." Her jaw tightened, her charm flickering like a candle losing its flame. "You think you've won already, don't you?" she said, voice low. "You've turned my husband against me, humiliated me in front of everyone, and now you sit there pretending to be the victim." James's eyes stayed steady on hers. "Truth doesn't need rehearsal," he said simply. The line hung in the air. Even David, sitting quietly between them, looked down at his plate, caught between loyalty and clarity. For the first time, he saw both of them as they truly were, the father who had lost everything but dignity, and the wife who had gained everything but peace. The room's stillness broke only when James's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced down. A message from Lucas. "New evidence found. You'll want to see this tonight." He folded the napkin carefully, setting it beside his plate. "Dinner was enlightening," he said softly. "But I think we're done here." Vanessa's eyes widened. "You can't just walk out, not after—" But he was already standing, buttoning his coat, his expression unreadable. He gave David a nod, half reassurance, half farewell, and turned toward the door. Vanessa's voice followed him, trembling now, stripped of pretense. "What are you planning, James?" He paused at the threshold, the candlelight framing his silhouette. "Nothing," he said without looking back. "The truth does its own work." Then he stepped into the night, leaving her in the soft flicker of dying candles and her own growing fear. The morning sun hadn't even cleared the skyline when the first headline hit: "Forgery allegations against local gallerist Vanessa Porter." The photo beneath it showed her smiling beside one of Helen's paintings, the same smile that now looked rehearsed, artificial, almost cruel in hindsight. Within minutes, every local news outlet had picked it up. By noon, it had spread across national feeds, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. Lucas West had made his move. The proofs he leaked to the press were irrefutable. Copies of Vanessa's forged signatures, notarized inconsistencies, and audio of her own voice discussing adjusting paperwork. The evidence didn't just point toward guilt, it painted it, stroke by damning stroke. The story was airtight. At her gallery, the fallout hit like a wave. Calls from sponsors turned into voicemails. Texts from investors went unanswered. By lunchtime, 2 of her biggest backers had issued public statements cutting ties with her until further notice. Gallery assistants whispered behind her back, one quietly removing the Porter Foundation banner from the front display. Vanessa stood in her office, the walls closing in around her. Her phone kept buzzing. Reporters, lawyers, board members, all wanting explanations she didn't have. No comment had stopped working an hour ago. She gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. Then, without thinking, she snatched her keys and stormed out. Lucas was mid-meeting when she burst through his office door, eyes wild, the mask finally cracked. "You think this is justice?" she spat. "You had no right to go to the press." Lucas didn't flinch. He closed the folder he'd been reviewing, adjusting his glasses with unhurried precision. "I didn't go to the press," he said calmly. "The press came to me. They wanted proof. I provided it. You think this will make you some kind of hero? She shouted, voice trembling. You've ruined my life. He met her gaze, unblinking. No, Vanessa, you did that yourself. You wrote your own confession, emails, audio, every careless word you thought no one would ever hear. All I did was open the envelope. For a moment, her fury faltered. Her breath came unevenly, her expression flickering between disbelief and panic. You don't understand, she whispered. I was trying to protect yourself, he finished for her. Yes, I understand perfectly. She turned sharply, storming out as abruptly as she'd arrived. The door slammed behind her, the sound reverberating through the quiet office like punctuation on a sentence she couldn't rewrite. Across town, David sat alone in the kitchen, the television tuned to a live segment dissecting his wife's downfall. Photos of forged deeds and court filings flashed on screen. With each new revelation, his stomach sank lower. The woman he'd defended, the woman he'd shared a home and a life with, had built it all on lies. When the camera cut to a clip of James standing beside Lucas at the courthouse steps, David turned up the volume. His father said nothing. No statement, no gloating, just a faint nod when asked for comment. In that quiet image, David saw everything: grief, integrity, and a justice that didn't need to scream. Back at home, James sat in his study, the newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched tea. The house was still, sunlight spilling across Helen's paintings. On the television, Vanessa's face filled the screen, angry, cornered, undone. James watched without a word, his reflection faint in the glass. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, not in triumph, but in peace. The truth, at last, had found its way into daylight. But the light also revealed something else. This battle wasn't finished. Not yet. It began just after noon. The air outside Vanessa Porter's gallery was thick with the hum of city traffic and the faint metallic buzz of anticipation. Then came the sound that shifted everything, the screech of tires, followed by the clipped authority of police voices. Within seconds, black and white cruisers pulled up to the curb, lights flashing red and blue across the gallery's glass facade. Inside, Vanessa was hosting a private viewing for a handful of loyal clients, trying to salvage the scraps of her reputation. Champagne flutes glittered in her hand, her voice still smooth, though her pulse raced beneath her skin. When the door burst open and two uniformed officers stepped inside, her glass slipped and shattered on the marble floor. "Mrs. Vanessa Porter?" the lead officer asked. His tone left no room for confusion. "We have a warrant to search these premises. Step aside, please." The color drained from her face. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, turning toward the guests with a forced laugh. "This is ridiculous." But her voice cracked midway through the word ridiculous. Outside, a crowd began to form. Neighbors, passers-by, reporters who seemed to materialize out of thin air. Cameras pointed like weapons. Every flash caught another piece of her crumbling world. The officers moved methodically, pulling open drawers, cabinets, storage rooms. Box after box was carried out, labeled deeds, contracts, appraisals. Each one was photographed, sealed, and tagged as evidence. The once pristine gallery floor turned into a battlefield of paperwork and humiliation. Vanessa followed them, her heels clicking frantically against the tile. "Those are private records," she snapped. "You can't just—" One of the detectives interrupted, holding up a document. "This one has your signature, and this is the same signature traced 3 times over on different forms. You want to explain that?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. Then, from across the room, her assistant, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, spoke up. "She made me do it," she blurted out. "I didn't want to, but she said it was just a technical correction. She told me to copy his signature." The room froze. Even the reporters outside fell silent for a moment as her confession echoed through the open doorway. Vanessa spun toward her, eyes wide with disbelief, or maybe desperation. "You liar," she hissed. "You think you can pin this on me?" But the assistant couldn't even look at her. David arrived just then, pushing through the crowd, face pale, tie loosened, disbelief written all over him. Cameras turned instantly, hungry for the family reunion no one wanted. He stopped just inside the threshold, staring at his wife, the woman he once defended against everyone. Outside the glass, James Porter stood a few paces back, leaning on his cane, watching. He said nothing. His expression was unreadable, carved in stillness, as if he were witnessing not justice, but inevitability. The officers finally approached Vanessa. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us." She stiffened, jaw clenched. "This isn't over," she whispered, just loud enough for James to hear as they led her past him. Her eyes locked on his, cold, furious, promising something dark. James didn't flinch. He only shifted his gaze slightly toward the horizon, where the flashing lights painted the street in relentless red and blue. As Vanessa was escorted into the waiting car, her glare lingered through the window, defiant even as her world collapsed. And James stood there quietly, the chaos spinning around him, knowing this war had only changed battlefields, never truly ended. For 3 days, Vanessa Porter was gone. No calls, no sightings, no updates from her lawyer. Her phone went straight to voicemail, her car abandoned behind the gallery. It was as though the chaos had swallowed her whole, leaving only the echo of her name across headlines that were already growing stale. David hadn't slept. The guilt ate at him in restless circles. If he'd seen the signs sooner, if he'd stopped her, if he'd been stronger. On the 4th morning, he stood in the local precinct, filling out the missing person report himself. The officer's pen scratched across the paper as David tried to recall the last time he'd heard her voice. 2 days ago, he said finally. No, maybe 3. She sounded different. He didn't say broken. That word hurt too much. Back at the coastal house, the silence felt heavy. Grace had stopped by with groceries, a quiet gesture that had become her way of taking care of James. She found him on the porch, a blanket draped over his knees, eyes on the gray horizon. She's gone, Grace said softly, setting the bag down. David's at the station now. James didn't move, his gaze steady on the waves. She isn't gone, he said finally. Not really. She's thinking. Silence is her last weapon. Grace tilted her head. You think she's planning something? I think she's deciding who to blame next. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, a kind of quiet readiness. The next evening, as the sun bled into the sea, a car pulled up the long gravel drive. David's phone rang first, then the sound of hurried footsteps filled the hall. James rose slowly, leaning on his cane, as the front door opened. Vanessa stood there. Her once pristine image was gone, makeup smeared, eyes red-rimmed, hair tangled like she'd been driving for days. The defiance that once fueled her charm was still there, but now it burned darker, stripped of polish. You happy now? She demanded, stepping into the light. You got what you wanted. The gallery's shut down. My sponsors vanished. My life, gone because of you. James watched her for a moment before speaking, his tone almost gentle. You did that yourself, Vanessa. She laughed, sharp, bitter, cracking at the edges. You think you're so righteous, sitting there in your little house, pretending you didn't destroy me. I didn't destroy you, he said evenly. I just stopped you from destroying anyone else. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The tension in the room coiled tighter, thick enough to cut through. David stood frozen near the doorway, torn between pity and disgust. Grace watched from the porch, her face unreadable. Vanessa's voice dropped to a whisper. You think this is over? James held her gaze. No, he said quietly, but you're running out of ways to fight. Something in her expression cracked. Not defeat, but fury without direction. She turned sharply, pushing past David, her heels echoing down the hall as she vanished into the darkened guest room. James stayed where he was, the air around him still humming with her anger. Grace stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You were right," she said softly. Silence was her last weapon. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the closed door. And now she's learning what happens when it stops working. The house fell still again, but beneath that silence, something simmered, her rage, his resolve, and the certainty that this battle wasn't over. Not yet. The storm came late that night, rain clawing at the windows as if the sky itself were restless. Lucas sat alone in his office, lamplight washing over piles of case files and folders marked Porter vs. Porter. The room smelled faintly of coffee and exhaustion. He had spent hours combing through statements, each number a clue, each transfer a whisper of deceit. And then, buried deep in a chain of shell accounts registered under false names, he found it. A single offshore account, registered in Vanessa Porter's maiden name. The balance stared back at him in the glow of the monitor, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lucas's jaw tightened as he opened the attached transaction log. The dates matched perfectly with the art appraisals and the sales receipts of Helen's paintings, pieces Vanessa had claimed were donated for charity. Every cent had been funneled quietly overseas, disguised as legitimate gallery income. He picked up the phone and called James. "I found it," he said simply. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind wet pavement and air that felt washed clean. James drove into the city in silence, the proof folder resting on the passenger seat like a live wire. The cafe he chose for the meeting was quiet, the kind of place where even whispers seemed to echo. Vanessa arrived late, sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too many sleepless nights. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, tone defensive before the conversation even began. James gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." For a moment, she hesitated. Then she did, crossing her legs, chin lifted in defiance. "If this is about the case again, I've told my lawyer." He cut her off by sliding the folder toward her. "It's not about the case. It's about this." She frowned, opening it slowly. The color drained from her face as her eyes scanned the account number, the wire confirmations, the offshore routing details. Her breath hitched when she reached the page marked Source of Funds, Helen Porter Artwork Sales. "I don't," she started, voice trembling. "I don't know what this is." "Don't lie, Vanessa," James said, calm and deliberate. His hands stayed folded, his voice steady enough to make the truth sharper. "You sold Helen's work. You took the last pieces of her life and turned them into profit. You hid it in a foreign account. And you thought no one would ever trace it." She slammed the folder shut, trying to recover her composure. "You can't prove that was me. Anyone could have..." But James simply reached forward, opening it again to reveal the final page, a signature authorization form, written in her unmistakable handwriting. He looked her in the eyes. "You underestimated honesty," he said quietly. "It doesn't need to hide." Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating, final. Outside, the cafe door chimed softly as someone left, the gust of wind breaking the tension for just a moment. Vanessa stared down at the documents, the realization settling like lead in her chest. The fight had turned, and she knew it. James stood, gathering the folder. "We're done here," he said. As he walked away, she sat frozen, her reflection trembling in the window. Her silence said more than denial ever could. She wasn't innocent. She wasn't misunderstood. She was caught, and she knew it. The afternoon sun spilled weakly through the blinds, catching dust motes as they drifted across the study. James sat at his desk, quietly organizing the latest evidence from Lucas, when he heard the sound of footsteps pounding through the hall. David's voice followed, hoarse, broken. "Dad," he called, storming into the room, his face pale and eyes rimmed red. He held a crumpled paper in his trembling hand. "She forged my signature, too." James looked up slowly, his breath catching for just a moment. David slammed the document onto the desk, a notarized transfer authorization, his own name scrawled across the bottom in ink that wasn't his. "This one's for the insurance accounts," David said, his voice shaking between disbelief and fury. "She took out loans against my name, Dad." The words hung in the air like smoke. James didn't speak right away. He unfolded the paper, scanning the lines. The signature was perfect, identical to David's, but James had seen too many forgeries lately to be fooled. "She used you," he said quietly. Something inside David snapped. "Used me." His voice rose, trembling with anger and shame. "She destroyed me, my marriage, my job, my reputation, gone because I believed her." He shoved the chair back, pacing the room. "You warned me. Grace did. Hell, even Mom probably would have seen through her. But I didn't. I just—" His words broke off, crushed under the weight of everything he couldn't say. He slammed his fist against the door frame, the sound sharp and hollow. "You've destroyed everything," he shouted toward the empty hallway, as if she were standing there listening. Vanessa wasn't, but her absence filled the room just the same. James stood slowly, his cane tapping once against the floor. For a moment, David looked ready to collapse under the weight of it all. His shoulders hunched, his breathing ragged. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I loved her. God help me, I still do. And she turned me into a fool." A sound came from the doorway. Vanessa stood there, pale and trembling, mascara streaking her cheeks. Her voice was raw. "David, please," she said, stepping forward. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect us." He spun on her, eyes blazing. "Protect us? You forged my name. You lied to everyone who ever cared about you." Her composure shattered. The sob that escaped her didn't sound human. It was grief, tangled with guilt, desperation, and the hollow realization that no one in that room would ever believe her again. She sank against the wall, crying openly, but her tears fell into silence. David didn't move to comfort her. Neither did James. Instead, James reached out and rested a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "You're still my family," he said softly. "That hasn't changed." David's eyes filled again, this time not with anger, but relief. For the first time in years, the space between father and son felt bridged, not by victory, but by shared pain. Vanessa's sobs echoed faintly through the hall as James guided David toward the porch. The evening light spilled across their faces, warm and forgiving. Inside, the house remained heavy with the sound of regret, but outside, just beyond the threshold, something fragile and real had been mended. The battle had broken everything else, but between them, family had survived. And now, finally, it was starting to heal. The fall from grace was slow at first, then sudden, like a chandelier giving way after one last flicker. Vanessa Porter, once photographed on every society page, now found her name printed beneath headlines that reeked of scandal. Her phone, once buzzing with invitations and compliments, had fallen silent. Sponsors disappeared. Friends stopped returning calls. Her social circle, the same one she'd so carefully built from charm and influence, had evaporated overnight. At luncheons, people who once clung to her every word now whispered behind napkins. The art world that had once adored her avoided her like a contagion. Every door that had opened for her now stayed firmly closed. Even her gallery assistants had resigned quietly, one by one, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the smell of stale paint in their wake. While her world unraveled in public, James lived in deliberate quiet. He refused interviews, declined comment requests, and let the noise of public curiosity pass him by. Instead, he spent his mornings tending the small garden behind his home, pruning the same roses Helen once cared for. He took peace in their silence, in the slow return of color to a place that had once felt gray. Lucas West, however, was not idle. Each day he worked meticulously, filing motion after motion, everyone backed by evidence so clear it stripped away the last of Vanessa's defense. "Each page is another nail," he said to James over coffee one morning, "and we're almost done hammering." James nodded, quiet satisfaction softening the lines around his eyes. "Just make sure the hammer is steady," he said. A week later came the deposition, Vanessa's final stand before trial. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. The press wasn't allowed inside, but the outcome would reach them soon enough. David sat across the table from her, eyes hollow but resolute. He had come not as a husband, but as a witness. Lucas guided him carefully through the questions. "Did you witness your wife forging any documents?" David hesitated, pain flickering across his face. "I didn't see it directly," he said, "but I found the files afterward, and I know what she's capable of." Vanessa tried to interrupt, voice trembling, but Lucas cut her off. "Please let the witness finish." Her composure cracked visibly then. The cameras outside would later catch her leaving the courthouse, her makeup streaked, her expression raw, her once poised demeanor replaced by something desperate and unfamiliar. That footage would circle the evening news, labeled simply, "The Fall of Vanessa Porter." Across town, James watched it all unfold from his living room, the television muted. The footage showed her surrounded by reporters, shielding her face from the flashes. Her fall was public, but his victory remained private. He didn't smile. He simply exhaled, as though releasing something that had been trapped inside him for too long. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sea salt through the open window. The house was quiet again, but not empty. For the first time in months, the air felt breathable. The fight was nearing its end, and for the first time, James Porter allowed himself to do something he hadn't done since it began. He breathed freely. Still, beyond that peace, the courthouse loomed on the horizon. The final reckoning was coming, and both of them knew it. The courthouse was packed long before the hearing began. Cameras waited on the steps, reporters murmuring as though the air itself carried electricity. Inside, beneath the solemn glow of the skylight, the tension was thick enough to feel. This was the final trial, the day when truth would no longer whisper, but speak. James Porter sat quietly beside Lucas West, hands folded, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. He looked calm, but there was a stillness in his face that carried years of weight, grief, betrayal, endurance. Behind him, David sat alone, a silent pillar of support. Their relationship, once fractured by lies, now felt unshakable in its quiet loyalty. Grace sat in the second row, clutching James's cane, ready for the moment he would need it. Across the aisle, Vanessa sat with her lawyer. The confidence that once radiated from her was gone. Her posture was tight, her face pale beneath layers of courtroom makeup. She clutched a pen as though it could anchor her in place. Her lawyer leaned in occasionally, whispering strategies, but even he seemed to know the tide was no longer theirs. The judge entered, and the room rose. The scrape of chairs against marble echoed like thunder. When everyone sat again, Lucas stood. "Your Honor," he began, his tone steady, his presence commanding. "We are here not for speculation, but for evidence." He opened a file and began his work, slow, deliberate, surgical. One by one, he laid out the forged forms, the falsified deeds, the notarized signatures that bore the marks of fraud. He projected timestamps onto a screen, linking them to Vanessa's own emails, each one building a chain too strong to break. Then came the witness statements. Clerks, gallery staff, even the assistant who had once worked under Vanessa's command. Their words, once whispered in fear, now echoed through the room, confirming every deception she'd spun. Vanessa's lawyer tried to object, to challenge the evidence, but Lucas dismantled each attempt with calm precision. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent, except for the faint scratching of pens taking notes. Finally, the judge turned to Vanessa. "Mrs. Porter," she said, "you may speak." Vanessa rose, trembling slightly. Her voice wavered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was trying to protect my family. I thought—" Her words faltered under the weight of the truth surrounding her. The silence that followed wasn't sympathetic. It was hollow, the sound of disbelief. Lucas said nothing. He didn't need to. The evidence had spoken for him. Then, the clerk called James Porter to the stand. Grace rose with him, handing him his cane. Every eye followed as he made his way forward. When he took the oath, his voice didn't shake. His testimony was simple, factual, and devastating. He described how she'd asked for his signature under false pretenses, how trust had been turned into a weapon, how the home he'd built with his late wife had nearly been lost. He spoke not of revenge, but of truth. By the time he finished, Vanessa's lawyer couldn't meet his eyes. The weight of it was undeniable, the quiet power of a man who had nothing left to lose, except the truth itself. The judge's gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Vanessa. Her lawyer sat motionless, shoulders heavy, eyes lowered in defeat. He didn't need to say it aloud. Everyone could feel it. The case was lost. James returned to his seat, exhaling softly. Grace pressed his cane into his hand, and David placed a steady palm on his father's shoulder. The courtroom silence felt like an ending. But in James's mind, it was only the beginning of peace. Still, as Vanessa stared forward, her tears drying into resolve, one truth lingered unspoken. The verdict was coming. And when it did, no one, not even her, could undo what had been revealed. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every seat was filled, every reporter poised with pen or camera in hand. The air carried that strange, heavy stillness that only exists before a verdict, when time seems to wait for justice to speak. Judge Alvarez adjusted her glasses and lifted the stack of papers before her. After reviewing the evidence presented, the court finds sufficient and overwhelming proof of fraudulent misrepresentation in the property transfer and related transactions. Her voice was steady, deliberate, each word a nail sealing the fate that had taken months to reach. The Porter residence and all associated assets are to be returned to the legal ownership of Mr. James Porter. All other holdings under Mrs. Vanessa Porter's name are hereby frozen pending restitution proceedings. For a moment, the words just hung there, unreal. Vanessa's breath caught first, a low broken sound that echoed through the quiet room. Her hands trembled as she gripped the table, knuckles white. The mascara she'd tried to wear like armor had long since streaked down her cheeks. A single, hollow sob escaped her, then another, until she was shaking in the silence. David sat behind his father, his face pale and still. When the gavel came down, the final strike was almost merciful in its finality. He leaned forward, voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, eyes brimming with tears. "For everything." James turned to him slowly, eyes soft. "I know," he said. "It's over now." His voice was quiet but sure, carrying the kind of peace that comes only after surviving a long storm. He stood carefully, leaning on his cane as the clerk gathered papers. Reporters surged to their feet, cameras flashing, questions flying. "Mr. Porter, how does it feel to win? Do you plan to press criminal charges? Will you forgive your daughter-in-law?" James didn't stop. He didn't need to. He simply raised a hand, polite but final, and walked past the chaos with the quiet dignity of a man who'd already answered all the questions that mattered. At the courthouse doors, Lucas West was waiting, his briefcase in one hand, his tie loosened just slightly for the first time in months. He extended his hand, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through his professional calm. "Justice served," he said simply. James shook his hand. "Justice," he echoed, "and peace." Together, they stepped into the sunlight. The courthouse behind them loomed tall and pale against the bright sky, but the air outside felt lighter, almost forgiving. For the first time in months, James noticed the scent of the ocean drifting on the breeze. It reminded him of Helen, of morning walks, of laughter that had once filled their home. He paused on the steps, closing his eyes for a moment. The noise of reporters and city traffic faded into a low hum. He took a slow breath, deep and steady, and when he exhaled, it felt like releasing every ounce of weight that had lived in his chest since that forged signature changed everything. The storm, at last, had passed. And though peace had returned, James knew life would never quite be the same. Justice might restore a house, but it could never rebuild the years stolen by betrayal. Still, as he opened his eyes to the clear California sky, he knew one thing for certain. What had been broken was finally his to rebuild. By sunrise, James Porter's name was everywhere. News anchors recited it like a moral fable. Headlines splashed it across every screen. Elderly man outsmarts greedy heir. A slow-motion clip of James leaving the courthouse, his cane steady, his expression calm, circulated online with captions calling him the man who beat betrayal. Within hours, strangers were sharing his story on social media, calling him a hero of quiet justice. James didn't see most of it. He wasn't glued to the news, didn't scroll through the endless stream of comments dissecting his life. While the country buzzed, he was in his backyard, kneeling among the garden beds, trimming the same rose bushes Helen once tended. The air smelled of damp earth and renewal. His world had shrunk again to something simple: soil, sun, and silence. Across the fence, Grace Dawson leaned on the railing holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You do realize you've gone viral, right?" she teased, her voice half amusement, half disbelief. "You're the internet's favorite widower. There's even a hashtag." James glanced up, brushing dirt from his hands. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," she continued, grinning. "They're calling you Professor Justice. People are writing poems about you, James. Actual poems." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let them talk," he said. "If people find something worth learning from this, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing." Grace handed him a mug. "Still, you could give one interview. Tell your side." He took a slow sip before answering. "The truth doesn't need an interview. It already stood up for itself." That was the thing about James. He didn't need applause. He didn't crave the spotlight that had found him. His victory had come not through shouting, but through patience, through the stubborn insistence on honesty in a world addicted to noise. Meanwhile, across the city, Vanessa was trapped in her own version of that noise. Paparazzi camped outside her temporary apartment, cameras waiting for a glimpse of the woman who'd betrayed her own family. Each headline cut deeper. Vanessa Porter vanishes from public life. Former gallerist silent amid scandal. She hid behind drawn curtains, the light from her phone screen illuminating the ruins of her reputation. Messages from former friends went unanswered. Her name had become a cautionary tale, the villain in a story that now belonged entirely to someone else. For James, the noise of her downfall didn't bring satisfaction. It brought quiet. For once, the world wasn't tilted against him. He could breathe again without bitterness crowding the air. He spent his afternoons repainting the garden fence, repairing the small things that had been neglected during the chaos. Neighbors stopped by sometimes, leaving baked goods, small notes, even letters of thanks. He appreciated them, but he didn't keep any clippings or articles. Justice, he thought, didn't live in headlines. It lived in peace. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the coastal hills, Grace joined him on the porch, her laughter soft in the fading light. "You know," she said, Some people chase justice their whole lives and never find it. James smiled faintly, his eyes tracing the horizon. Justice isn't something you chase, he said. It's something that arrives when you've waited long enough to listen for it. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, the world beyond it still buzzing with his story. But here, in this quiet corner of San Diego, there was only calm. Proof that sometimes the loudest form of justice is silence. The first sound of hammers on wood came at dawn, echoing through the quiet San Diego street. For the first time in years, James's house wasn't a museum of memories. It was a project in motion. The front porch, once sagging and gray, was stripped of its rot. Fresh beams replaced the broken ones. Windows that had been sealed shut during months of legal battles now stood wide open, breathing in sunlight and salt air from the coast. The house seemed to sigh with relief, as if it, too, had been holding its breath all this time. Neighbors arrived throughout the morning, some carrying trays of muffins, others with brushes and paint cans in hand. They came not out of pity, but out of quiet respect. Everyone in the community had read the story. Everyone knew what the house had survived. Now, they wanted to help bring it back to life. Grace moved through the front yard like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her sleeves rolled up, a sun hat tilted over her gray hair. She gave instructions with gentle authority. "That patch by the fence gets full light," she said to a teenager holding a flat of flowers. "We'll save those for Helen's lilies." Inside, laughter drifted from room to room, the sound of sanding, the smell of new paint. It all felt alive again. James watched from the hallway, leaning slightly on his cane, his eyes tracing the sunlight as it reached corners that had been dark for too long. In the backyard, David was working on the porch. His shirt was streaked with sawdust, his face flushed from the effort. The steady rhythm of the hammer filled the air. It was the same porch his mother had loved, the one where she'd sipped her morning tea and waved at neighbors passing by. When the last plank was nailed down, David stepped back, wiping his brow. "Feels lighter now," he said, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his voice. James joined him, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. "Truth clears walls," he said quietly, "and it builds stronger ones too." For a moment they stood there together, father and son, facing the sunlight, the wind from the ocean carrying the scent of something clean, something new. Later, Grace knelt beside the walkway, planting a row of Helen's favorite flowers, white daisies and lavender. Her fingers pressed into the soil with reverence, her movements careful and deliberate. When she was done, she brushed the dirt from her hands and looked toward James. "She'd love this," she said softly. James nodded, his voice caught somewhere between peace and memory. "She'd tell me to stop fussing and let the garden do the talking." Grace smiled. "Then it's already saying plenty." As the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the porch, the house seemed to glow, paint still wet, windows gleaming, air moving freely through every open space. Laughter echoed again from inside, mingling with the scent of flowers and fresh wood. For the first time since Helen's death, it didn't feel like a house haunted by loss. It felt alive, rebuilt not just with nails and paint, but with truth, forgiveness, and the quiet hands of those who cared. And in that still, golden hour, as James watched the light spill across the walls, he realized something deeper. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It begins quietly, like sunlight finding its way through a newly opened window. The City Hall auditorium was filled to its edges. Neighbors, officials, and reporters all gathered under the warm glow of stage lights. The banner stretched across the podium read, "Annual Civic Awards, Honoring Integrity in Action." James Porter stood near the front, wearing a simple gray suit, one hand resting on his cane. He hadn't wanted any of this. When the mayor called weeks ago, he tried to decline. But Grace had insisted, her voice firm yet kind. "You didn't just fight for yourself, James," she'd told him. "You reminded people what decency still looks like. Now, as the mayor spoke into the microphone, listing the events that had led to this moment, the fraud uncovered, the home restored, the quiet strength of a man who refused bitterness, James's eyes drifted across the crowd. He saw faces he knew, the neighbors who'd painted his porch, the young volunteers who'd helped rebuild the garden, even the courthouse clerk who'd wished him luck the day of the verdict. When his name was finally called, applause filled the hall. Not the explosive kind, but the steady, heartfelt rhythm of respect. Grace clapped the loudest. David, standing near the stage, caught his father's eye and nodded, his smile small but proud. Lucas was beside him, arms crossed, his expression calm and content. The work was done. James walked slowly to the podium, his cane tapping softly against the wooden steps. The mayor handed him the glass plaque, etched with his name, the words Integrity and Perseverance Award, glinting under the lights. Cameras flashed, the room momentarily lit by white bursts of attention. James took a breath, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. "I'm not sure what to say," he admitted, voice even and low. "I never set out to be honored for something that should be ordinary." The room quieted, every eye on him. Doing right. It isn't supposed to make headlines. It's just what you do, even when no one's watching. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. And sometimes, when the world turns cruel, the hardest thing isn't fighting back. It's staying kind while you do it. Then he stepped back, gave a faint smile, and said simply, "Do right, even when unseen." The applause that followed was different, louder now, more emotional, as if the entire room exhaled at once. But outside, in the shadows near the parking lot, another pair of eyes watched. Vanessa stood hidden behind the corner of a column, her hair pulled back, her posture small and unfamiliar. She wasn't dressed for attention anymore, no designer jacket, no makeup to hide behind. Just silence. Her gaze stayed fixed on the man at the podium, the one she'd tried so hard to undo. And as the applause echoed through the glass doors, something in her expression broke. Pride, regret, or maybe both. Inside, the ceremony drew to a close. David joined his father on stage, clapping him on the back, whispering something that made James smile. Lucas stepped forward, shaking James's hand. "Closure," he said softly. "Well earned." As flashbulbs went off one last time, James turned toward the audience, the award glinting faintly in his hand. The light softened, the crowd rose to their feet, and for a moment, the noise, the chaos, even the past, seemed to dissolve. Then, as the applause faded, James looked toward the doors, toward the night beyond the hall. The air shifted, calm and still. The noise of justice had quieted, leaving only the quiet dignity of peace. The night was quiet enough to hear the ocean breathing in the distance. The hum of the tide carried faintly up the hill, mingling with the rustle of leaves that lined the old porch. James sat in his usual chair, the one Helen used to tease him about never replacing, a mug of tea cooling beside him. The porch light cast a warm glow across the wooden steps, cutting through the chill of the coastal air. He heard the familiar crunch of gravel before he saw him. David's car door closed softly, and a moment later, his silhouette appeared at the gate, hesitant, almost unsure of its welcome. For a few seconds, he stood there, like a boy again, waiting for permission to come home. James didn't say a word. He just nodded toward the empty chair beside him. David climbed the steps and sat down, his shoulders heavy, his hands clasped tightly together. The silence stretched between them, not hostile now, just full of everything that had gone unsaid. "I let her blind me," David said finally, his voice low, ragged. "I kept telling myself she was doing the right thing, that she cared about family, but she cared about image. I saw it, Dad. I just didn't want to." James turned his gaze toward the horizon, the moonlight shimmering on the water. "We all choose love before truth," he said softly. "The trick is learning when to stop pretending the two are the same." David exhaled shakily, his eyes wet. I should have stood by you. I should have seen what she was doing. I let her tear us apart. James reached for his cane, resting it lightly across his knees. You were trying to protect your wife, he said gently. That's what a good man does. You just forgot that protecting doesn't mean defending what's wrong. The words landed with the kind of grace that comes only from forgiveness long prepared. David swallowed hard, his throat tight. I don't deserve this, he whispered. You're my son, James replied. You never had to earn that. For a moment, David didn't move. Then he reached across the small space between them, his hand trembling slightly. James set his own hand over it, steady, firm, and forgiving. The gesture said what words couldn't. Enough had been lost already. Grace stood in the doorway, half hidden by the frame. She hadn't meant to interrupt, but she'd heard the car and come to make sure everything was all right. When she saw them there, father and son, hand over hand, she stayed still, watching quietly. Her eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. The breeze shifted, carrying the sound of waves through the open windows. The air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine from the garden below. James leaned back in his chair, his grip still resting over his son's. The night didn't need more words. The distance between them, once filled with pride and pain, was gone now, replaced by something quieter, stronger. In that stillness, forgiveness didn't arrive like thunder. It settled like dawn, slow, certain, and impossible to mistake. The ocean hummed, the porch light flickered, and the past, at last, began to loosen its hold. The morning light crept slowly across the study, glinting off framed photos and dust motes that floated like memories. James sat at his desk, a blank page before him, his pen poised but unmoving. The house was still, the kind of quiet that felt sacred rather than lonely. Outside, the garden was alive with the faint rustle of wind through Helen's flowers. He began to write, My dearest Helen, your home stands honest again. The words came slowly, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of everything he'd carried for too long. He told her about the garden Grace had replanted, about the neighbors who'd helped rebuild the porch, about how David was finally coming around for dinner again. He wrote not to mourn, but to share, to catch her up on the life she'd built and the love that had somehow outlasted betrayal. You were right, as always, he continued. Love survives the storms. Even when the roof shakes, even when the walls fall, it's still there, waiting to be rebuilt. When he signed his name, his hand lingered over the final period. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into an envelope that he sealed with the same care he'd once used, turning down the covers on her side of the bed. Then he reached for the bouquet resting beside him, white lilies, Helen's favorite, and made his way out into the golden morning. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, the coastal road stretching long and familiar. The sea shimmered on the horizon, the same soft blue Helen used to paint into every canvas she touched. When he reached her resting place, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting warm light across the rows of headstones. He knelt, setting the lilies gently at the base of her grave. Your home stands honest again, he said softly, the words from his letter finding their voice. And it finally feels like you're in every room again, not as a memory, but as peace. The sound of gravel crunching behind him made him turn. David stood there, hands in his pockets, the wind tugging lightly at his jacket. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod before kneeling beside his father. Together, they looked at Helen's name etched in stone, each letter carved deep and clear, unchanging. For a while, they didn't speak. Then David chuckled quietly. She'd be scolding us for not trimming those hedges again. James smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. She'd have forgiven everything, he said, sooner than either of us deserved. They stayed until the light softened into gold. The ocean breeze drifted through the cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies and salt. The sky burned orange and pink, the sun setting gently behind the headstones, casting long, soft shadows across the grass. When James finally stood, his movements were slow but sure. The ache of loss was still there, but it no longer hollowed him. It filled him instead, reshaped into gratitude. As father and son walked back toward the car, the air seemed lighter, the day more complete. Peace didn't arrive with fanfare. It unfolded quietly, like sunlight on old stone, steady and enduring. And as they drove home, the letter to Helen rested in James's pocket, warm against his heart, carrying the weight of a love that refused to die. The morning sun bathed the old Porter home in soft gold, its light spilling through the open windows onto freshly painted walls. The air smelled of sawdust and new beginnings. Months had passed since the trial, and for the first time, the house didn't carry the echo of anger or loss. It hummed quietly with purpose. James stood at the edge of the yard, watching a group of children unload brushes and paint cans from a van marked San Diego Youth Art Program. The laughter of young voices filled the air, rising and falling like birdsong. The program was small, but it was his, or rather hers. He'd donated part of the property, what used to be the old guest house, to a local youth art initiative. It now bore a new name, the Helen Porter Creative Center. The sign over the entrance shimmered faintly in the sunlight, hand-painted by a teenager named Lily, who reminded him of Helen. Quiet, focused, always covered in specks of color. Inside, the once empty walls were alive again. Canvases leaned against easels. Sketchbooks lay open on tables. Paint-streaked rags and half-finished murals replaced the hollow order the space once held. It was no longer a place of deception. It was a workshop for possibility. Grace moved through the room, clipboard in hand, giving gentle direction to the students as they began tracing outlines on the largest wall. Her energy was effortless, natural. When she caught James watching, she smiled. "You'd think I've been managing foundations all my life," she teased. He chuckled softly. "You were managing me long before this." The kids had decided to paint a mural, a sprawling piece that stretched across the old gallery's interior wall. It was their idea, born from the story they'd read in the local paper about the man who rebuilt what betrayal tried to break. The first strokes began to take form, the outline of a lighthouse, its beam spreading across storm-dark waves. James stood in the doorway, listening to the soft scrape of brushes, the hum of conversation. The sound felt like forgiveness in motion. Grace stepped up beside him, wiping a streak of blue paint from her arm. "She'd love this," she said quietly. James's eyes softened, fixed on the mural. "She would," he said. Helen believed love wasn't meant to last in one place. It was supposed to keep growing. He paused, voice lowering to a whisper. "Her love taught me revenge isn't destruction, it's renewal." Grace looked at him, her smile touched with something deeper, respect, maybe pride. "Then you've done her justice," she said. Outside, neighbors gathered at the fence, watching as the kids worked. Applause broke out when the first section of the mural was complete, a bright burst of yellow light spreading across gray waves. James didn't step forward to take credit. He stayed near the doorway, hands in his pockets, simply watching. The community had seen him fight for truth. Now, they were seeing what he'd built from it. As the afternoon sun shifted, the mural came to life. The lighthouse glowing, the sea calm, the horizon wide and forgiving. In that moment, James realized something Helen had always known. Redemption doesn't come from tearing down the past. It comes from painting over it, one honest stroke at a time. The afternoon was gray and windless, the kind of day that made the ocean seem closer than it really was. James sat by the window, the faint sound of children's laughter drifting from the art center next door. Brushes clinked in jars. Grace's voice carried soft encouragement, and the house, his home, felt at peace again. Then came the knock. 3 slow, hesitant taps on the front door. He rose carefully, leaning on his cane, the rhythm of those knocks echoing through his chest. When he opened the door, time seemed to pause. Vanessa stood on the porch. Gone was the polished woman who used to glide through rooms with confidence and perfume. What stood before him now was someone smaller, her shoulders slumped, her face drawn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Her clothes were plain, her hair unkempt, her expression stripped of pretense. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked entirely human. "Vanessa," he said quietly. She swallowed hard, her voice fragile, almost breaking. "I lost everything." The words came out like confession, not complaint. The house, the gallery, the money, even the friends who said they'd stand by me, they're all gone. She hesitated, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I needed to say it out loud." For a long moment, neither spoke. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of salt and lilac from the garden. James studied her face, not with anger, but with the kind of sorrow that sits too deep to name. "Then maybe," he said slowly, "you can start over." Her lips parted as if to argue, but the fight never came. The words seemed to hit her harder than accusation ever could. Her gaze dropped to the porch floor, where the wood bore the faint scuff marks of her old heels, the woman she'd been when deceit still paid well. "I don't know how," she whispered. "None of us do," he replied. "We just learn by losing." There was no triumph in his tone, no bitterness, just truth, plain, clean, unadorned. Vanessa nodded faintly, her eyes glassy but dry. She took one last look past him, into the home she'd once nearly taken, the fresh paint, the open light, the faint laughter from the next room. It all belonged to the life she'd destroyed but couldn't erase. "I'm sorry," she said finally, so quiet it almost vanished into the wind. James didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, giving her space to walk away without shame. She turned, stepping off the porch, her figure small against the pale sky. She didn't look back, not once. From the hallway, David watched through the doorway. He'd come in silence, unseen, but now stood with his arms crossed loosely, his eyes following her as she disappeared down the road. He didn't speak either. He didn't need to. His shoulders seemed lighter, his breath steady. James joined him at the doorway, the two men framed by the fading light. The sound of distant waves filled the pause between them. "Quiet mercy," James said, almost to himself. "That's how things end right." David nodded, and as the last trace of Vanessa vanished into the gray horizon, the house felt still, truly still, for the first time in years. The chapter had closed, not with revenge, not with victory, but with something rarer, peace that expected nothing in return. The evening sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting a honeyed glow across the table. It was Friday, a day that had quietly become family dinner night since the house had been rebuilt. The scent of roasted herbs and butter filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of laughter from the living room. James moved slowly but confidently, setting plates with deliberate care. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. It breathed again, with life, with family. David entered carrying a bottle of wine, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression lighter than it had been in years. Behind him came Ethan, tall now, confident in a way that reminded James of Helen's unshakable warmth. The boy had his mother's smile, his father's eyes, and the same quiet steadiness that James recognized from his own reflection. They gathered around the table, the clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation filling the room. Midway through the meal, Ethan set his fork down, his eyes flicking between his father and grandfather. "I got something today," he said. his tone calm but charged with excitement. "A letter." David arched a brow. "A letter? From who?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, sliding it across the table to James. The return address was from a law school, Stanford University. James froze, his eyes widening slightly as he read the embossed lettering. "I got in," Ethan said, his grin breaking wide now. "Full acceptance. First semester starts this fall." For a moment, the table was silent, just the sound of the ocean breeze slipping through the open window. Then, softly, James exhaled, the lines of his face easing into a smile. "Stanford," he said, almost in disbelief. "Your grandmother would be, well, she'd be beyond proud." Ethan's smile softened. "I want to study law because of you," he said. "I want to defend people like you, Grandpa. People who get pushed around, lied to, taken advantage of, and don't have anyone to stand up for them." The words hit James deeper than he expected. Pride swelled in his chest, but so did something gentler, humility. He'd spent his life teaching words, not wielding them in court, yet somehow, through pain and perseverance, his story had become someone else's purpose. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening. "Then do it right, Ethan. Not for the glory, not for the noise. Do it because truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." Ethan nodded. "That's the plan." Grace, seated beside James, lifted her glass, the flicker of candlelight catching her eyes. "Then I think this deserves a toast," she said, her voice steady. "To truth that lasts." The clink of glasses filled the air, followed by laughter. Real, unforced laughter that rolled through the house like music. For a moment, James simply watched them, his family, his home, his legacy. The silence that once haunted these walls had been replaced by something richer. Connection, warmth, continuation. He caught Grace's gaze across the table and smiled. The years of storms had finally led here, to this small, perfect peace. As the laughter faded into soft conversation, James leaned back, looking out the window at the deepening sky. The ocean shimmered in the distance, endless and calm. Legacy, he realized, wasn't built on wealth or revenge. It was built on what survived you. And tonight, surrounded by love, truth, and second chances, his legacy had never felt stronger. A full year had passed since the storm, since the day James Porter walked into the courthouse as a broken man and walked out with the truth at his side. The seasons had turned gently, trading chaos for calm. The house he'd rebuilt was now alive with laughter, dinners, and quiet mornings. The garden had bloomed twice over, each flower seeming to whisper that healing doesn't come in sudden bursts. It grows quietly when no one's watching. But today wasn't about the house or the garden. It was about remembering where the road to peace began. James dressed simply that morning, navy jacket, pressed shirt, his cane polished smooth from a year's worth of use. He took the bus downtown instead of driving. He wanted to move slowly, to feel the city as it was now, alive, lighter, no longer shadowed by scandal. Vendors filled the sidewalks, the smell of coffee and salt air mixing in the breeze. When he reached the courthouse, he stopped at the steps, staring up at the marble facade. It looked smaller than he remembered. Maybe he'd grown, not in height, but in understanding. A year ago, those walls had felt like judgment. Today, they felt like closure. He walked to the small bench near the entrance, the one where he'd sat that first day, clutching papers and fear in equal measure. The wood had been replaced since then, sanded smooth, freshly varnished. Someone had added a small brass plaque along the backrest. He leaned closer, reading the inscription. "Justice begins with truth." A faint smile touched his lips. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a single rose, red, vibrant, freshly cut from his garden that morning. He placed it gently on the bench, the petals catching the sunlight. "Worth the wait," he murmured. For a while, he simply sat there, listening. The city hummed around him, buses passing, footsteps echoing, laughter spilling from a nearby cafe, all the sounds of life carrying on. It struck him how small his pain had seemed against the scale of time. The patience it had taken to endure had changed him more than victory ever could. He looked up toward the courthouse glass doors. The reflection staring back wasn't the same man who'd once been deceived, humiliated, and nearly erased. This version of James stood taller, the lines on his face softer, not from age, but from acceptance. He caught his own reflection's faint smile and returned it. As he rose to leave, a gust of wind swept through the plaza, carrying with it the faint scent of ocean salt and blooming jasmine. It wrapped around him gently like an unseen embrace. He paused at the edge of the steps, gazing down toward the busy street. The world had moved on, but it hadn't forgotten him, and he, in turn, no longer carried the weight of needing to be remembered. Closure, he thought, isn't given. It's earned, day by day, step by step, breath by breath. James adjusted his jacket, took one last look at the bench, and began walking toward the sunlight, cane tapping a steady rhythm against the stone. The sound was no longer that of an old man leaning on the past. It was the quiet, confident beat of a man finally moving forward. James drove along the winding coastal road, the steady hum of the car filling the quiet space between him and the horizon. The morning light was just beginning to brush the sky with hues of pink and gold. It had been a long while since he'd made this drive, though the route had once been as familiar as his own breath. This was where Helen had always wanted to be, where the sea met the cliffs, where the air was thick with salt and possibility. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its white tower breaking the soft skyline. He slowed the car as he approached, the tires crunching softly over the gravel path that led up to the rocky outcrop. For a moment, he simply sat in the car, staring at it. Memories rushed in like a tidal wave, each one layered with joy, then pain, then a quiet kind of peace that only comes after loss. He remembered their walks down the cliffside path, Helen's hand warm in his, her laughter ringing out as she teased him about the wind messing up his hair. He remembered the nights they spent watching the waves, talking about dreams they'd never chase, secrets they'd never share. And then there had been the betrayal, the way everything had shattered so suddenly, like glass breaking too sharply against stone. But now, the shards had finally found their place again, piecing together something stronger, something whole. James stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the lighthouse, his cane tapping against the ground. He had always loved this spot, how the sea stretched endlessly, a reminder of how small the human heart can seem in the vastness of the world, yet how deeply it can feel the weight of its place in it. The wind tugged at his jacket, and he stood there for a long while, watching the water roll in, the waves breaking against the rocks below. He had spent so many years trying to outrun the weight of grief, and now, in this moment, he finally felt the stillness of it. "We're all right now," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind, but the sea seemed to hear it, the waves steady and sure against the shore. His heart had been a storm for so long, turbulent, relentless. But today, it was quiet. The sun rose higher, its glow turning the water to gold, lighting up the horizon in a way that made everything feel infinite. James blinked slowly, his breath catching in his throat. A tear slid down his cheek, the first in what felt like years. But there was no sorrow in it, just the weight of something finally being released, something long held. The tears were for the past he could never fully leave behind, and for the future he'd learned to face. He smiled then, the corners of his mouth lifting with a quiet kind of relief. The light was steady now. Reflecting on the water, the lighthouse standing tall in the distance like a beacon of hope he hadn't realized he still needed. The camera pulled wide, capturing the waves crashing against the rocks, the light breaking across the sea. And in that moment, James Porter stood alone, yet not alone. Not anymore. Forgiveness had come, not with a grand gesture, but with a single step. It had come with patience, with letting go, with the slow return of peace that only time can bring. The sea crashed again, but James felt no tremor, only calm. The evening light was warm, spilling across the table where the family had gathered. The simple clink of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, and the scent of homemade stew filled the room. Laughter came easily now, not forced or rushed, but comfortable, like it belonged. James watched from the head of the table, the light casting a glow on the faces around him. David, still a little unsure but solid beside him. Grace, her eyes sparkling with quiet pride. And Ethan, who sat with a kind of steady joy that reminded James of the son he'd hoped he'd raise. It was a meal that didn't need words to make it whole. The walls of the house had been cleared, both physically and emotionally, and the silence that had once filled this space with grief now sat like a familiar companion, present, but not overpowering. The space Helen had left behind was no longer empty. It was filled with new memories. James stood up and walked to the front door, his hands gently resting on the handle. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised with the last hues of twilight. He closed the door behind him softly, the sound quiet but final. It wasn't just the door of the house that closed, it was the door on the past he'd been fighting to leave behind. As he stepped back into the house, he paused to look around. The photos of Helen, their life together, lined the walls, their wedding day, their travels, family gatherings that felt like lifetimes ago. The frames were simple, the faces inside still full of joy, full of love. There was no anger here, no bitterness, just the warmth of a life well lived, of a love that, despite all the forces that tried to tear it apart, remained. They tried to steal my home. His voice echoed in his mind, the words coming back with an unexpected clarity. Instead, they gave me back my purpose. The camera lingered on James as he stood in the doorway, the house now alive with the soft murmur of voices and the faint hum of the evening breeze. The flickering light from the porch cast a long shadow across the floor, soft and steady, like the house itself, rebuilt, reborn, unshakable. James glanced once more toward the table, where his family still gathered, their conversations blending with the quiet rhythm of life around them. He'd fought long and hard for this peace. He'd fought for the space to love without fear, to trust without doubt. And now, as the sounds of laughter filled the house, he realized that he was no longer just surviving, he was living. The camera panned slowly toward the flickering porch light, its glow casting an inviting warmth against the gathering dusk. Outside, the ocean wind stirred, carrying with it the salty promise of something constant, something unchanging. The world outside would always shift, but in this house, in this moment, there was only peace. Justice doesn't shout, the voiceover whispered, the words heavy with finality. It arrives. The title card appeared, simple but firm. Justice doesn't shout, it arrives. And as the screen faded to black, the sound of quiet laughter and the soft whisper of the ocean wind remained. A quiet reminder that, sometimes, the most important things aren't the loudest. They're the ones that linger, unspoken, and settle into the heart.